Welcome back to Texas Sawdust. This week we're digging into the doors and the crown molding for the upper cabinets. Let's dig in.
The first thing I like to do when working on doors is get the raw lumber and just run it through the planer and expose the grain a little bit so you can decide what panels you're going to use and decide where you're going to place individual grain pieces. Once I have that decided, it's on over to the chop saw to chop everything down and label the individual pieces so that I know which ones go with which, plan everything out accordingly because all these panels are wide enough that they're going to have to be glued up. I also take an opportunity to mark any defects out that I find while I'm doing this. After I've got everything planned out, it's on to the jointer and the planer to get everything flat and get everything prepped for gluing. This is one of those times I really enjoy this planer because it can hog through material faster than I can feed it sometimes. Once all the boards are finished being planed, I set them aside and get ready to glue them up. Somehow I lost that footage, and so unfortunately you don't get to watch me glue panels together. While all those panels are drying, I actually don't have enough clamps to glue everything at once, so I'm just working on the rails and stiles during that time. And first step is to chop everything down. I kind of measure out what length the pieces are, try to optimize my material to make everything work. Run them through the jointer and then run them through the planer. I'm able to get several rails or stiles out of the width of these boards because they're each about 2.5 inches wide. And then it's on to the table saw. Like I mentioned earlier, all of these pieces are exactly the same width, so I can just run them through all 2.5 inches. Once they're cut down, I take them over to the chop saw, and I like to cut both the top rail and bottom rail and the left stile and right stile of each door at the same time so they end up exactly the same length. That way, if you have any variation between rails or stiles, that doesn't get captured. After they're cut down, it's time to run them through the router table. If you missed the previous episode, I went over a little bit more in detail on how this is done, making the side panels, so make sure to go check out part 2. This is just me cutting all the mortises and tenons. While I was doing that, everything had a chance to dry, and it was on to the table saw to cut the larger panels all down to size. I had one edge jointed, and on some of these I was trying to center the grain, so I would cut down one side and then flip it over and cut a little bit more off to make sure that the larger pieces that showed the grain were in the center of the panel. Others that were made out of multiple pieces didn't matter as much, but I try to maximize the figuring of the grain on all these doors. These smaller panels I actually ended up making twice because I made them once and then I messed up on my calculation on how big they should be, and I ended up having to make them about 1 inch wider. But the real kicker was this panel here. I cut it down and it should have been right. It was wrong. It was 1 inch off. And I realized that as soon as I cut it. I was like, oh, that looks a little small. And sure enough, it was. So I said, no matter, we'll glue it back up. And so I did. I actually flipped that board over because I just didn't want the grain to have a jump in it. So I flipped it over so it kind of looked like a separate board, even though it was from the same board. I mentioned earlier how I really like this planer, and this is the real reason I love it. Having the ability to plane down something that's up to 20 inches wide is a huge advantage. Normally you'd have to plane all these to thickness, and then once they're planed to thickness, you glue them up and you're real careful about it. I've got plenty of play here because I left them a little bit thick. Once I had them planed to thickness, I just cut them down on the chop saw. The ends are not hypercritical. You want all your panels to be the correct length, but you can see here I'm flipping the boards to be able to cut the wider ones since the chop saw doesn't quite reach. And if that cut doesn't land up just right, it's not a problem because these are all going to get a rabbet on them and they'll fit into the mortises on all of our rails and stiles. I've had this planer for about a year now, and I haven't really had to plane down any really wide panels. And I accidentally made this one a little bit too wide. And I said, oh, well, I'll just run a light pass the wrong direction through the planer because the grain was going the wrong direction. And that was clearly a mistake. The first one, I got a little bit of chip out. The second one, you saw I had that giant chunk break off, and it was very noisy. I was very worried I broke something, but luckily it was okay. I decided to take this over to the CNC that I have access to, luckily, and I just reduced the thickness on that, was able to proceed with the project. Otherwise, another option would have been to cut it down and plane it and then re-glue it back together. Once everything's planed to thickness, it was time to put the rabbets in that I mentioned earlier. Last time I made the side panels, I did this on the router table, which you can definitely do. This time I decided to use the dado stack on the table saw. Both are very viable options. Having done both, I think I like the dado stack a little bit more. Table saw is just so fast and such a reduced risk of chip out, in my opinion. Now, I'm going on each side just around the board here, and what I should have done is I should have done the two ends and then done the two sides, and that would have reduced the risk of chip out on the finished corners on the back of these doors, but it all ended up okay. At this point, it's on to sanding. I like to use a light to help find any defects. Here, I'm just marking inside the mortises where the actual rails are going to end because I want to avoid sanding in those areas before glue up because that is how you're going to keep your tight fit. Before gluing everything up on these panels, put a nice thin coat of shellac in the edges. That way, if there's any wood movement in the future, it will show a finished edge rather than shrinking potentially and showing an unfinished edge. An advantage of shellac is it dries extremely fast. By the time I move on to the next panel, the one that I just wiped on is practically dry. I like to make sure that when assembling these, I have a decent amount of glue on each edge because I want to get some squeeze out. If there's any defect in the way that these mortise and tenons fit up, that glue will help take that up, especially on a lighter wood like this. There shouldn't really be any because they're a match set for the router, but it just gives you one extra piece of insurance to ensure that you get a nice looking joint. I just use these additional clamps to kind of get everything to fit up correctly, and then I like to use some old rags or maybe even an old sock or two if you have it lying around that you're ready to throw away. They work great for glue ups because once you use them, they're trash anyways. I'm finishing these out with a nice chamfer on both sides, a large chamfer on one side, and the back side will have a smaller chamfer. I made the mistake of not running these through multiple times or trying to make shallow passes the first go around, and I ended up actually getting a little bit of chip out that I needed to fix. Here you can see it's not very deep. So to help reduce chip out, I actually ran the end grain through as a climb cut and then went back to conventional cutting. That way it really helps reduce getting chip out on that end grain. By this point I realized I should really take multiple passes, so I'm just running it through lightly, taking little chunks off. Once I had the panel all routed, I went back to fix that. It was shallow enough, I just put a little bit of CA glue on there and was able to run it back through the router table and really clean it up. Gave it a quick sanding, and you can see here I wiped some finish off. It's visible if you look for it, but if you don't know it's there, you'll never see it. So that's one trick that you can use if you're going to do a clear finish and just have the natural wood color. That's one trick you can do to hide any defects that you have. Here I'm just doing the back chamfers. It's small enough, easy to do in one pass. With all the panels glued up, the chamfers added, and everything looking towards finished state, it was time to drill the holes for all the hinges. I'm using Bloom soft close hinges. They are fantastic and produce a very nice finished product. Most of the time you can get away with doing just 2 hinges. However, these are hickory doors, so they're a little heavier than normal. And the other issue is they're very tall and wide. And if you look up on Bloom's website, you can actually see the recommended number of hinges. And these doors all need 3 hinges because of all of the factors I just listed.
So I just finished mocking up this crown molding. It's just a simple piece of hickory, about 3/4 thick, 3 inches long, and then several angles cut on the table saw. You can kind of see here. I made the mock-up. I had planned on putting crown molding on the top of these cabinets. And then I was looking at it and I was discussing it with my wife, and we decided, we don't think really crown molding fits our style with these cabinets. They're more of a shaker style, rustic look, and crown molding, we don't know if that's going to really fit our style there. So our plan is to finish these cabinets, get them up there, get them in the kitchen, install them, and if we go back and decide that we want to add crown molding, we'll always be able to add it later. But for now, we're going to skip that step. But just so you know, if you plan on making some crown molding, you can either make it yourself or you can buy crown molding. I opted to make it. It was actually just 4 different cuts on the table saw, all at 30 degrees. So I actually had the table saw set at 60 to get those 30-degree cuts. And one cut here, and then one cut across here, one up, and then one back across. And that created my crown molding. At that point, it's just as simple of getting all the angles cut to make your mitered corners meet, or however you're going to do that. So unfortunately, we're not going to go over that, but it is doable. At this point, I'm getting pretty excited. These doors are looking fantastic. The upper cabinets are really getting close to being done and ready for finish. I have a little bit of work left to do on 1 or 2 of these doors. I need to chamfer them still, but they are this close, and I will be moving on to putting finish on. Once the finish is on there, final assembly, and then install time. So join me next time. I look forward to it. Thanks for joining me this week, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know if you appreciate the content I'm putting out, and we'll see you next time. Until then, get out to the shop. These doors are really coming along. Not doors, the cabinets.